Is the draft Supreme Court opinion, which undoes Roe v. Wade, the decision that guaranteed women the right to exercise agency and control over their bodies for nearly 50 years, is this opinion the beginning of the unraveling of so many more freedoms and rights that we enjoy in this country? And where do we go from here? These are the questions I'm asking, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Two days ago, Politico got a bombshell piece of information, piece of news, tip from the Supreme Court, and they published it. And what they published shocked the world, I should say, definitely the United States, because it was a draft opinion by Justice Samuel Alito indicating that he, as the author of this opinion, had four other conservative justices in his camp. And this opinion overturns the court's landmark decision in Roe versus Wade. And for those of you who maybe didn't watch the news for the last couple of days and haven't been really tracking what's happening around women's reproductive health, Roe versus Wade is that seminal decision decided by the Supreme Court some 49 years ago, which legalized abortion in every state in this country. Now, this draft opinion that was leaked by some person, we don't know who, may have been one of the justices themselves, could have been a clerk, could have been anyone that had access to the opinion. But it sent shockwaves through communities throughout this country, and it caused women and men to take to the streets. All over this nation, we saw protests erupt, including in front of the Supreme Court. Now, some conservative pundits have lauded the decision, while others have expressed their outrage that this opinion could be leaked. They're demanding a full investigation and, in fact, are demanding that someone who leaked it be prosecuted and sent to jail for some ungodly number of years. So yes, the outrage culture is fully at work. Now, those on the left, those who have been fighting for women's rights for decades, are extremely troubled, disappointed, shocked and amazed, but not surprised. Not surprised because we know for the last several decades, there has been a concerted effort by Republicans to undo Roe v. Wade, to have it overturned, to roll back abortion rights for women in this country. But some are asking, is this more? Is there more at work? And are Republicans and conservatives just beginning the process of unraveling so many rights that we enjoy in this country? Here to help us break all of this down is my first guest. She is a law professor at the University of Louisville, and her work focuses on reproductive rights and birthing decisions. Joining me this morning is Professor Jamie Abrams. Good morning, Professor Abrams. I know you told me to call you Jamie, so I'll go back and forth, I'm sure, throughout this interview. But thank you so much for joining me. Just start with give me your initial reaction when you either read the political article or you got an alert on your phone, or however you were made aware of this draft opinion. What were your initial reactions?
Yeah, my initial reaction was shock at the leak. Then upon reading the opinion, bluntly, my reaction was sheer emotion. It's gutting, searing, raw, vulnerable. And I'm reading it as a professor, thinking about how I'm going to teach my students, how I'm going to update my casebook, but it was impossible to set aside the callousness of how this is expressed in the draft opinion.
So let's talk about the leak first. Mm-hmm. Outrage by the Republicans, attacks on Joe Biden, even some ridiculous article that suggests that we never had a leak like this until Ketanji Brown Jackson was appointed to the Supreme Court. So by inference, these law clerks that she must have already hired and that she's somehow secretly placed in the Supreme Court got a hold to this opinion and they are the cause of the leak. So there are all of these conspiracy theories and completely nut job people or nutty people, I should call them, out there just spewing these ridiculous theories. But why is this leak causing people to have such a emotional response? Not the substance of the leak, but the leak itself.
Yeah, I think, first of all, notably, Ketanji Brown Jackson was not on the court when the opinion was written at all. It's dated February 1st, the draft that we're looking at. And she's not circulated on it whatsoever. But the core sort of conspiracy, issue, I think, is the legitimacy of our Supreme Court. We always have known we've been enshrined in legislative and electoral politics and these sort of fights on the ground. But I think folks on both sides for a long time, and all sides, felt that the court held a certain decorum, a certain legitimacy, held a certain more revered place above the messiness of ordinary on the ground politics. And so seeing this, whoever leaked it for whatever reason clearly had a political or strategic reason. It's way too early to know what or who or which side that reason sits. But it does feed into a really difficult conversation about the politicization of the court itself and about Justice Roberts' control of the court and the decorum. It has longstanding practices that have always been well regarded. I'm reminded here of the beautiful friendship between Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg, relationships and professional boundaries that surpassed ordinary politics. And so this is a staggering commentary, I think, on the legitimacy of the court, in addition to its implications for rule of law, democracy, equality, civil rights, et cetera.
So you mentioned this long-standing kind of practice of the court of not obviously disclosing draft opinions before they are final opinions. Explain, what a draft is of an opinion versus what a final opinion is, and what can happen in between the vote and the drafting of the draft and the issuance of the final opinion.
Yeah, so all of the justices need to decide where they stand. So they'll meet in conference and take votes and sort of get the numbers and figure out what votes do they have a majority? Do various justices sit in a dissent? And a lot of that brokering depends on what the opinion itself says. If the opinion says something with which a potentially aligned justice disagrees, that might lead to a concurrence instead, where they agree with the result, but for very different reasons. And so this process is a distinctly private process for good reason, because it creates a safe space for justices to discuss what the opinion is and why the opinion will be reasoned as it is. And so notably, the two cases for which the precedent is in question, Roe and Casey, Roe itself was actually argued twice because the composition of the court changed and it led to a new drafting of the opinion. And the final opinion was a sort of combination of the original draft and the second. And there are some accounts that the Casey composition of the court, which was only a plurality, not a majority, changed in that drafting process. So the privacy of the justices to figure out what the holding will be and what its reasoning will ultimately express are really compromised here, because now any who would change a vote or any reasoning that changes will have to account to the public in a way that a justice would ordinarily have been protected by the decorum of the court.
So what is likely to happen? A lot of questions, a lot of folks still holding out hope and reiterating that as of today, Roe is still the law of the land. Nothing has changed. Abortions are still legal in every state throughout the country, that this draft opinion has no legal relevance. But what could happen between now and the issuance of that opinion, which we expect sometime in June? Is there going to be like a second vote? Are they going to get together again in some secret conference room and take another vote?
They're definitely going to get together and have a tough conversation about what happened here. But it does compromise drafting, because now, it's simple track changes. Every scholar, activist, legislator who's going to look at this final opinion can just run a simple track changes between what the initial opinion was and what the new opinion was, and scrutinize it and wonder where it came from. Did it come from public backlash? Did it come from protests? Did it come from political pressure? So it's going to be a tough move for the court to figure out how to get this to a final opinion in its 6 to 8 week timeline of where it needs to go. The other piece that's happening legally and politically is state legislatures. And so what it's suggesting in its draft form, but what it's suggesting is that this question will move to the states. And right now, 13 states have trigger laws in place that already clarify exactly what will happen in the event an opinion like this makes it to law. But for the states that don't, what we can watch, I think, on the state level is whether states marshal resources and political power to pass laws either protecting or limiting access to abortion, getting ahead of this decision. So it really puts the cart before the horse in that context, because it's creating a sort of political swirl that folks could opportunize on in various ways.
So trigger laws, meaning that if you're in a state like Mississippi or somewhere like that, that has tried to limit women's rights to abortion, the minute the opinion is issued, it triggers their state law that would then ban abortion or limit abortion in that state. So that's what trigger means. Like when X happens, it triggers Y to happen. And it happens pretty automatically. They don't have to get together at the state legislative level and take another vote. They've already decided that when Roe comes down, it's going to trigger their own abortion laws in their state. Let's go back and talk about Casey, because Casey is that second case that gets talked about a lot, but I'm not sure lay people, people who haven't gone to law school, understand the significance of Casey. That's the Casey v. Planned Parenthood case. So how does Casey come into this draft opinion and the overturning of Roe v. Wade?
Yeah, so just to get a running start into it, Roe famously set out more of a trimester framework where governing how states could regulate abortion. And then Casey came in and replaced that with what's known as a viability standard. And so before the point of viability, that is the definition of when a fetus is capable of life outside of the womb, states may not ban outright abortion, but they may regulate, and in the interest of both fetal health and in the interest of maternal health. After the point of viability, states can, and many have, banned abortion access after that point. And so the centrality of that point in the case that is in question, the Dobbs case, is a Mississippi statute that banned abortion after the 15-week mark, which in the gestational cycle falls before the viability line, which is usually closer to the 24-week mark. So what the statute that Mississippi enacted purported to do was move up that viability line in square conflict with the Casey holding.
And this draft, if it becomes final, overturns Roe and Casey as well, for all practical purposes.
Both explicitly so.
Right. So let's talk about the impact. You mentioned the emotional impact that it had on you, and I know it had a similar one on me. I spent all day yesterday talking about this on TV and talking about it in text messages and talking about it on social media, and so many, millions of people around the country did the same. Can you think of another decision that has had that kind of impact on the American public like this one has in the recent, 10, 20 years or so?
I can't think of anything quite so sweeping in what it's, and the irony of that is part of the court's reasoning is saying that Roe and Casey didn't give us closure. It didn't resolve a very divisive, difficult decision, and therefore it's not good reasoning and therefore is not good law. When the irony, the painful irony, is that a decision like this, were it ultimately adopted, will be chaotic at the state level for legislators and legislatures, but more importantly, for women trying to navigate a rapidly changing state.
You made a good point about the decision saying, Alito, who wrote it, saying that Casey and Roe are bad law because it didn't bring closure to this very complicated issue of abortion. But is that even a consideration that the court should be taking? Because you also just said that the reason all of this is in secrecy, the voting and the discussion about how people are going to vote, the 9 justices are going to vote, is so that they're not influenced by public opinion and protests that are happening outside of their offices, or what people are saying on social media. But it seems like Alito does just the opposite and says, well, we decided Roe and it didn't really decide the abortion issue. People are still upset about it, up in arms about it, fighting about it. So let's just do away with it altogether. I just couldn't understand the logic in that.
Yeah, and the logic is very flawed, even as he's describing an opinion that he concludes to be logically flawed. It's very, I mean, it feels like gaslighting as an ordinary woman reading it, how that's happening. And to your point about the court being influenced by public opinion, that's another reason why this release is so shocking to this process, because somebody obviously sought to influence public opinion for unclear motives at this moment. But the court pretends, even in the opinion, to be above that and to not be influenced by the conversation on the ground. And it purports to adopt this objective analysis, but this objective analysis is, of course, woefully lacking in any understanding of pregnancy, women's lived experiences, hardship, poverty, geographic mobility. It's lacking in all of that.
Yeah. And you mentioned the whole viability issue that is decided in Casey, and Casey puts viability around 24 weeks. Is that like agreed upon in the scientific community? Because I don't know, how many months are you pregnant at 24 weeks? That's 6 months.
Yeah.
So is that pretty much understood to be the point at which the scientific community agrees on?
So it's definitely more of a moving, it's not, and as we see in law with other words like reasonable and substantial, it is a little bit of a movable line. And one of the things that Justice Alito does on that point particularly that feels uniquely cruel to the history of the court is he throws back at Justice Ginsburg and other progressive law scholars, accomplished folks who've written thoughtfully about this opinion and its implications, where they have critiqued this question of the viability line and how workable it is. And Alito's reasoning sort of throws that back and says, see, even folks on the left have said that this wasn't workable. But we have standards like that in law all the time that have a little room for movement depending on a particular pregnancy or particular changing medical standards and norms. And we use that viability line in other places. For example, we use it in tort law. If a fetus were to die in utero from a prescription drug or domestic violence or an injury, we use that viability line in tort law as well. And there certainly are not existing proposals to wholesale do away with that line there, although clearly that could be a collateral implication.
Are there states that have laws that allow for abortions after the so-called predetermined viability, line of 24 weeks?
There are with heavy exceptions, very narrow exceptions. And so those are very rare cases, late term, known as more commonly as a late term abortion. They're exceedingly rare. They're exceedingly raw and searing. We're usually talking about incredibly difficult medical consultations around the life of the pregnant woman and the viability of the fetus for very complex reasons. If we're having a conversation,
really complex medical issue going on with the mom or the baby at that point, or the fetus at that point. The other part of the reasoning. So one of the things that Alito says in this opinion, this draft opinion, almost 100 pages, is that the word abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution. And he uses that to say, see, this is why these opinions, Roe and Casey, are bad, egregiously wrong, is the words he uses. Help us understand the flaw in his argument about the absence of the word abortion.
Yes, it's profoundly disingenuous to write in that way. If we think about what our Constitution does, our Constitution guarantees us almost no positive rights, like a right to education or a right to healthcare or a right to anything. Our Constitution is generally thought of in a negative rights framework. The government cannot quarter soldiers in my home or search my property without probable cause and warrant. And so our entire constitutional framework is around what the government can't do, not around affirmative guarantees of rights. And so to pretend that centuries ago, when women's very legal existence was enveloped in their husband, and if they didn't have a husband, then it was lost entirely, to pretend that that there would ever be a scenario where a right of this nature would be enshrined, and forget the politics of abortion, any other a positive right of this nature regarding the family, parenting, marriage, decision-making, intimacy, is profoundly disingenuous to how our Constitution is structured. And so here, instead, what would have been more genuine and authentic to the literature and the law would be to be framing this around the decisions that we make about our bodies, the right to bodily autonomy, from whether that involves fertility or undergoing cancer treatment or any other decision. That's the more appropriate frame. It's an umbrella that has to do with when the state can take away a right to make a decision about our bodies. And that would have been the more authentic thing to be looking at. Historically, have we as a country, is it enshrined in our nation's history and tradition to let people make decisions about their own bodies? And if we frame it that way, we actually reveal instead a staggering concern about the history, particularly for women of color and low-income women, that the government has actually intervened in deeply harmful and traumatic ways in communities. And we should have incredible suspicion and mistrust when the government wants to regulate reproduction, because the history of government regulation in this space is so closely aligned with the history of white supremacy and of segregation and racial injustice.
So then, in that frame of there being no affirmative rights identified in the Constitution, and if there were, clearly they wouldn't have been related to women, because we weren't even considered as basic humans during the writing of the Constitution. As you said, all of our rights were enveloped in those of the men in our lives. How do we get to Roe in the first place? It's a due process type argument, right? So help us understand what the more rational way we get to a Roe in the Constitution, even though the words abortion aren't there.
Yes. And so historically, the court recognized that in all these other rights, so the right to not quarter soldiers in your home, the right to speech, all that there were sort of larger things emanating from that protect and respect a right to privacy, particularly a right to privacy in the family and decision-making and intimacy. And so the court in Roe housed this right under the 14th Amendment's protection for liberty, and it connected it to many other rights, LGBTQ rights, particularly the right to marriage. And so so that's where this right sits. I think of it as sort of an umbrella right, the right to privacy, the right to decision-making, and it has decision-making pieces, it has relational pieces about how we make decisions about intimacy with others. It's an umbrella right, and many other rights are situated under that same umbrella. And so what the court has done here is it has come into that umbrella, taken this one narrow right, and purports to crush that right. But the question is, what then does that do to all the corollary interests that sit adjacent in all of the jurisprudence and all of the cases? Can that be authentically done? And
that's the next question is, you go into under the umbrella and you pull out the rights to control your reproductive health and make decisions about that. What stops the court from then going to marriage and then going to some of those other rights that are under that umbrella? Isn't this just the opening of that door, that slippery slope that would allow a conservative court that we know is hostile to things like gay marriage? And even a question came up with Ketanji Brown Jackson about interracial marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, interracial.
Clarence Thomas is married to a white woman, so.
No, and interracial marriages, so the way Justice Alito addresses it is he says, this is unlike all of those other things because there's a fetal life involved here. But the reality is the reason we were regulating was because of morality and majoritarian, particularly white men, legislators and judges, their views of morality before people of color and women had a seat, even could possibly have had a seat on these judiciaries. And so one key point to understand this decision is that Roe v. Wade preceded other constitutional constitutional cases that looked at questions of how and when a state can discriminate on the basis of sex and gender. And so one key piece of this is that the equal protection analysis, the idea that similarly situated people should be treated similarly under the law, and that we can't target women in their medical decision-making in ways that are discriminatory. The law on Roe v. Wade ever so briefly preceded those cases. So one critical historical context point is that these cases, the abortion cases, have never layered in what ordinary viewers and thinkers might say, isn't this about women's rights? Why are we not talking about equality? And that's because of the timing and history of this particular case. So it leaves the line of abortion.
Make sure I'm following. So you're saying the equal protection cases that identify or codify the notion that women and men can't be treated differently, those cases happened after Roe.
That's exactly right. And then if women and men are going to be treated differently, the court's going to just look with some ratcheting up. It's going to look a little more suspiciously, and it's going to make sure that that regulation is as tightly written as it possibly can. And so
there's never been an opportunity for those equal protection cases and the reasoning to be wrapped into the Roe v. Wade and the abortion rights cases. So there was, after Roe and Casey, the courts never decided another case that would have allowed them to do that?
So they did not, they certainly decided many cases that would have allowed that, but the jurisprudence never incorporated it, not for lack of advocacy. In fact, there are tremendous amicus briefs filed in this case by historians, by constitutional scholars, advocating that this right has to be layered in and understood as part of the constitutional jurisprudence. And there's a tiny paragraph in the opinion where Justice Alito sort of pushes it aside and says, well, we didn't do it in Casey, so why would we do this now? But the problem is precedent, right? Stare decisis was driving advocates this whole way. So advocates, find a path that had protected the abortion right and the broader right to privacy, and they stayed in that lane, like gradually trying to layer in more protections, but also under stare decisis, following the reasoning that had been set out by the court through and through. And so now Justice Alito sort of disingenuously throws it back and says, well, this isn't in the analysis, but he's a talented constitutional scholar. He knows much better than to suggest such a thing.
So should we be worried about these other rights, even though he, as you said, tries to carve out some distinction based on fetal life? But I'm not feeling very confident that there's not going to be cases now that these Republicans won't feel emboldened and say, yeah, let's go and challenge gay marriages. Let's challenge interracial marriages and figure out another way to, take a right from under that umbrella.
Right. And he's very flippant about it and about what the court wants to do, but it's not what the court wants to do. It's what case can make it to the court. And so if we believe that there are advocates on the ground who want to challenge interracial marriage and sodomy and sexual intimacy, those cases, the court can't control whether they make it into the court system. So I think this is where we have to look on the ground to the real politics happening in states and how how conservatives are mobilizing voters in the story that they're telling. And on interracial marriage particularly, we have to remind ourselves that these statutes about interracial marriage were not about marriage in itself. It was about marriage and reproduction. So Loving v. Virginia, that particular case specifically was about the mixing of bloodlines through reproduction. And so we have to expand and remind ourselves that those marriage statutes, while we celebrate them, and the removal of them all, it was not just marriage. It was marriage and the reproduction that follows.
What about the abortion pill? We're hearing a lot about that. So if abortions are illegal, why wouldn't the pill be illegal?
So it's a great question. So what the government is doing, what the draft opinion is doing here, is pulling the federal constitutional frame away and leaving it to the state. So it doesn't. There's nothing about this that says that from a regulatory standpoint, having a product like this on the market regulated through our federal agencies is in any way problematic in this opinion. But we know from experience that medication abortions are next. And what they're going to raise questions of is basic geographic mobility, like movement of women across state lines and products across state lines. And these questions just on a human level are staggering to imagine that you could get a pill in one state and not in another. And so there's an interesting question because federal law regulates products that are on the market for good reason. So when I take a Tylenol in my home state and you take a Tylenol in your home state, we know. And so here, the idea that state law is coming in and regulating that pill differently than what the federal government is, how the framework set out by the federal government does suggest there might be some room here to try to exert more federal authority over those state laws to try to rein in.
Like if you're in Connecticut and the abortion pill is illegal in Connecticut and you go to New York, are you going to be arrested if you bring a bottle of abortion pills from New York back to Connecticut and take the pill in Connecticut?
I mean, these are the tough questions we're going to have to work with, is this surveillance state. When we talked about abortion and the concept of a back alley abortion before, we didn't have the kind of surveillance we have with a basic prescription, a credit card, a phone call, and also all of the infrastructure on the ground, these amazing advocates who you'll talk to later in your show who are working tirelessly on the ground trying to counsel women. It's also questions of their safety. So not just the woman who gets the pill from Connecticut, but who's the person who helped get that call to Connecticut? And does that advocate have face liability? And what kind of surveillance state are we moving into over women's reproductive decision making, and where is that line? How far does that go? Fertility, sterilizations, freezing our eggs, embryos, all of it. And this line seems like, while the court might want to pretend that this is its work and it's done, that is not the reality of how cases make their way through and how precedent works.
Well, the fetal life exception definitely doesn't work when you start talking about freezing eggs and abortion pills, because all of that is related. It's, so much is proximate to that, what he is determining to be so special about this Roe decision. Before I let you go though, men, any cases ever decided by any Supreme Court that regulates the decision making that men have over their bodies? I'm just trying to, are there any cases that talk about, or that, have limited the way men can make decisions about their bodies?
No, and the piece of that, it's men and also parents. If you juxtapose this conversation out of abortion, we also in the same circle enshrine parental decision making in that same space. And so no, I think this is a really powerful point. For example, one of the cases that was cited in Roe involved a request for a bodily inspection as part of discovery in an ordinary civil case. And the court was like, absolutely not. No way would somebody have to subject their body to this kind of scrutiny. And so we see this, this sort of shock and disdain. And we've seen, states, for example, pass these or propose these laws that purport to regulate male reproductive decision-making in the same way, just to make a point politically. And it's shocking to hear, but that's really how we have to think about this.
Some of these laws, just I'm curious. You said some states have these laws just to try to gaslight us. But like, what do some of these laws say about men and their reproductive?
So I've never seen one actually enacted, but they're provocatively offered to make a point of, before a man can get a vasectomy, what you need to undergo counseling, you need to, all of these types of parallels to try to translate the kinds of obstacles an ordinary woman faces in access to abortion, and to say, what if men had to deal with that and miss work and figure out how to navigate this? So they're offered.
None of them have been passed by any of these men who want to regulate our bodies. Of course not. Okay. I was like, wait a minute, did I miss something? There's a law that regulates a man's penis? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Wow. Well, there's so much more here, Professor. You have been so helpful. And your information is great, and just helping us understand the complexity of this. That's, I think, the biggest takeaway from this, is that those people that think this isn't about them, or women who maybe say, well, I never had an abortion, I never get an abortion, I don't care about abortions. This is about so much more than abortion. So anyone that's, out there thinking this doesn't involve you, it does. Because it has the potential to unravel so many of the rights that we all enjoy when you talk about family and intimacy and privacy. And we've got to make sure people get that, because otherwise, this could just be like, more women in pink hats complaining, but it's not that. Thank you. And we'll be watching to see what happens. Obviously, June's going to be a big month to see, as you said, the track changes from this decision and see what Roberts comes up with, Justice Roberts, in his investigation. Quick question. Ted Cruz, Senator Cruz, said someone should go to jail. Is it a crime? Obviously, if one of the justices leaked this opinion, there is no rules that govern their behavior pretty much at all. They get to do whatever they want to do. So we know they wouldn't be punished, right? Criminally, legally?
No, I certainly am not aware of anything that it is a staggering breach of protocol and norm, but this is not like confidential information like our Department of Defense would be dealing with. It's not classified in that sense.
But why are these senators running around talking about people going to jail?
Well, and I think is a huge distraction, right, from talking about this larger political agenda and the work that's happening on the ground. It's a huge, huge distraction to be outraged about something and pretend you care about this when you care about, just the doorway to what you were already trying to get us into. Right. And, it reminds me in closing too, that all of these things the answer to all of these open questions are going to sit in electoral politics, which then spirals us into a whole separate show and conversation about voting rights and what's happening on the ground. And we're about to spiral this into a rigged playing field by design. Mm-hmm. And so that piece of it too, is that's what the court purports to trust the public and the voting process. But now it's
gutted the Voting Rights Act. They trust the voting of people that had rights that were gutted.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's exhausting. That's all I can say. That's my word today. It's exhausting. But thank you so much, Professor Abrams, for joining us. And I'll be calling on you again as we get, more information about this decision and where we go from here, because there is lots more to talk about. So watch this space. Again, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Next guest, they are the activists on the ground who now have to figure out what do we do, because we cannot rely on our Supreme Court. They have shown us over and over again what they will do when given an opportunity to roll back the rights, not just for women, but rights for all people, that they, in their infinite wisdom, they decide what morality should be. And that's so unfortunate. But the question is, what do we do next? Joining me is Marcia Jones. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Afaya Center in North Texas, and Amanda Furge. Amanda is a community organizer and pro-choice advocate in Mississippi. And Mississippi is the state, we know, where that Dobbs decision that made its way to the Supreme Court, it originated in Mississippi. Both are returning guests to the special report. Good morning, Marcia, and good morning, Amanda.
Good morning.
I'll start with you, Marcia. You were at the march after the Texas abortion law. And we knew something was coming. I don't think we knew this was coming, and we didn't know it was coming 2 days ago. So what was your immediate reaction, Marcia, when Politico dropped this bombshell?
So my immediate reaction was, if I could say this, was damn, like that, because I got an email from, because I've actually been on leave, right, for a few months. And so the goal was that I was going to make a soft return in May.
So much for plans, huh?
Yeah. And so I got an email, and so I was like, what the? And so I jumped up because the media was spinning it as the Supreme Court have made a decision. The Supreme Court and so I was like, wow. And so after the initial shock, it was like, okay, so let me get some real information. So let me listen to what some Black women are talking about, the women who I look to, as we shape how we advocate on the ground. Right. So let me see what's really happening. So after seeing what was really happening, I immediately thought about, okay, so how do we make sure that we get the information to the people on the ground that we are serving, that one, this is an argument, help them to understand what an argument is. Two, abortions right now today, while they're hard as hell to get in Texas, they are still legal. And three, what is the game plan? So I immediately I left being an ED and went into organizer on the ground advocacy, moving, how do we shift, and started to move around and get prepared for what I feel like will be the inevitable.
Well, welcome back. I wish there were different circumstances and that you had that time to ease your way back. But, this is where we find ourselves today. Amanda, you're in Mississippi. So you guys have been, I'm sure, watching everything that happens with this Dobbs case. What was the reaction on the ground in Mississippi?
You know what? Here in Mississippi, for folks doing this kind of work, we are another day at the office. right? We are familiar. While we get disappointed, we are not surprised or shocked when things go the way that white supremacy tends to go. So, the reaction.
Well, I would imagine in Mississippi, y'all, it ain't nothing that's gonna shock you. I hear you.
Snow in the summer might shock us, but otherwise, every day here is another day at the office. We're constantly, consistently doing the work to make sure that we have what we need and that the communities we serve have the education and that we're constantly collaborating. And so, like I said, while it's mildly, it's extremely disappointing for sure. Disappointment is definitely there, but the shock is expected. It's something that we're pretty used to. We're pretty used to that.
Yeah, I can understand. In a state like Mississippi, no, aspersions on Mississippi.
Hey.
Let me ask you this, Marsha. I saw a post this morning on social media. Someone said more white women voted for Donald Trump than who voted for Hillary Clinton. And if those white women had voted for Hillary Clinton in the way we thought they would, we would not be having this conversation because those 3 Trump justices would not be on the Supreme Court. What are you saying to the white women pro-choice advocates that you work with in Texas or that you've had an opportunity to work with across the country?
Listen, I'm so tired of talking to white women. I am really tired of talking to white women because we were saying this prior to. We know that white women have not always been as invested in this work as Black women because white women have not had to. They know they were not going to suffer the same losses as Black women and other non-white women would suffer. So they didn't get it. They chose not to get it. This was intentional on their part because we know that historically folk would put privilege in all of those things before doing the right thing. And so white women have historically voted for their privilege in opposed to voting the way we need to vote to ensure that these things that they take so for granted that we won't lose. And so I get tired of talking to white women. I get tired of talking about white women. And I just choose to put my energy into making sure that the Black women who are going, and Black folk, Black birthing folk, all of these folk, I was listening to your other interview prior to us, and I was thinking about, God dog it, and I was thinking about.
I think you lost your, we may have lost you for a minute, Marsha. While we get Marsha back, I will ask, we're going to get her back in a minute, but I'll ask you, Amanda. I know what Marsha is saying, and I hear that, and we see it posted on Black Twitter in particular, where people are saying, why do we keep talking about white women? And the only reason I keep asking the question and talking about white women is because we can't win in pivotal states, pivotal races without building coalition with white women. We saw that with the Hillary Clinton election. We've seen that with so many other key elections. So as much as we'd like to not keep talking about them, they hold such an important and critical vote in key states. So what's happening in Mississippi around trying to get those white women voters to come into the fold?
Well, in my personal experience, the white women that I work with or work alongside, if I'm working with them and working alongside them, then we are aligning in what we see the problem is and the work that we're trying to do. I recognize that because we're human beings need each other to get certain things done. And so I recognize that we will have to work in coalitions and we will have to, even if we aren't considerate of how they bring things to the table, but what they bring to a table. because that's just the way society is set up, right? We have to be amongst each other. So our focus, or my focus here, is to make sure that I'm aligning myself with folks who have the same goals, who are trying to accomplish the same things. I say this a lot about, my personal opinion on a lot of things. Say music, for example. I can't really get into what the artist does in their personal life. I don't know them personally. I've never been in their kitchen. What are they producing that I can access, or that people I care about are accessing, and how is that affecting what's going on around us or in the communities around us? And that's the approach I take for, I don't know how you phrased it, like people of non-color. I don't know what you call folks that ain't Black. That's how I
just make it real simple.
Yeah, folks that ain't Black. That's how I interpret and experience everyone. Like, what are we doing to either help each other, and how can we get away from the things that are happening that might be hurting each other?
That's a great approach. Let me ask you, Marsha, we got you back. What's happening now on the ground? I know you're out there educating people, which thank you for doing that, because a lot of people, as you said, might have read that headline and thought, oh my God, abortions now are illegal across this country. So thank you for letting people know this isn't the game is not over. That's just a draft. The final opinion does not come out yet. Won't be out for a couple of months. But what is the strategy? You said 3 things you were doing, and the third thing was figuring out what the plan is. So do you know what the plan is?
So we don't exactly know what the plan is. What we do know is that we can't stop doing what we've been doing. And we have to make sure that folk are getting access to abortions. We got to make sure that folk are getting to the places where they need to get to. We got to make sure that the money continues to come so that we can get the people where they need to be at. We got to make sure that we are doing our very best job to disseminate information in a way that folk are getting right information, that folk are getting righteous information, that folk are getting information that they can move on. We've got to make sure that the community understand that this not impacts impact folk who are choosing to or not birth, but it impacts every part of our lives. And so with that, making sure that we're getting informed folk to the polls to vote, so that informed folk can go to the poll and vote for folk who are more likely to fight or closer aligned with fighting for the things that's going to help the greater community. So at the end of the day, we have got to keep working on the ground. We cannot stop. I agree with you, sis. We have to keep fighting. This is really of no surprise to us. We have to keep fighting. We have never stopped. We never stopped. We were fighting before September 1. We were fighting before it was voted on in May, and this governor signed on it in June, because the women that we are fighting for have always been forgotten in this fight, have had the leaster of the voice to talk about these things and deal with the most critique and criticism of our bodies and the choices that we make. So our fight looked the same because we're fighting for the same folk, and we can't stop.
We were excited, Marsha, in the last election. We got super excited about Texas maybe moving from not red to blue, but red to purple maybe. And then when the results came in, we were disappointed because it didn't go as purple as we thought it would go. It didn't go purple at all. But now Beto O'Rourke is back running against Abbott in Texas, right? That election is coming up. Couple of months?
Yes, November.
Any chances that Texas moves from red to a little purple, or that Beto has a chance to beat Abbott?
I believe that. So it's a race. So I believe in a race, anybody got a chance to win. It's who get to the finish line first. So I believe that if we can stay on the ground, doing the work, informing the people, making the connection, helping people to understand that Greg Abbott has to leave, got to go. I believe we can win. I think we can emulate, we can copy off of what some of the other southern states are doing, like Georgia, for instance, and we can use some of their strategies. But we are going to have to be on the ground, because what beat us in Texas is rural areas. And so we're not really winning in Dallas. It just looked like we are. But there is an assumption that Dallas is blue. There is an assumption that some of these other larger metropolitan areas are.
You guys, both your big cities, Dallas and Houston, you've elected Black mayors.
Yeah, but we don't treat people so much all the time in Dallas like we're blue. That's what I'm saying. When I say there's an assumption, yes, there are elected officials who hold down these spaces, but also the people who are most harmed still are being harmed. So that's my to that. But I don't want to take away the fact that we do vote blue in Dallas, but folk are still harmed. So that's when I say there's an assumption. Okay. But
you're encouraged that there is.
Yeah, we want to make sure.
Okay, happening.
And so, but the Dallas and the Houston and places like that in Austin, yes, we can win, but we are going to have to do what these other states are doing in the South and who are winning. And we're going to have to get into these rural areas, not so much as to talk to white folk in rural areas or Republicans in rural areas, but we're going to have to talk to Black folk in rural areas or non-white folk in rural areas or people who are not committed to neither Democrat nor Republican. And we're going to have to, if we're going to win in Texas, if we're going to win in Texas, we'll have to listen to these younger people. We're going to have to listen to them. We may not want to, but we're going to have to. Listen to us. And this is coming from a 60-year-old woman here. We're going to have to listen to them, and we're going to have to be okay with following their lead. We're going to have to be able to be okay with being a part of their strategies, because if they don't vote, we won't win.
Oh, that's such a great point. I love what you say, Marsha. A couple of things you said that really resonate with me is there are non-white folks in rural areas. And a big part of when we say we're tired of begging and pleading with white women is saying we've got to mobilize the people that we can mobilize. So don't waste all our energy on people we know are unreliable. Let's go find those people who are not registered to vote or who maybe only vote once every 10, 20 years and get them out, get them energized into the polls. And the numbers say there are in most of these states enough of those people that if we could just get them turned out, we can win. What about in Mississippi, Amanda? So Marsha says we got to listen to younger people. What is it that you and your generation wants those of us who've been at this for a while to hear, so that we can make sure we are targeting and messaging in a way that will get you out? Because we can't do the midterms are going to be either a lot to celebrate or we're going to be under the covers crying. It's going to be so sad. We're going to be so hurt. But we want to be the opposite. We want to be celebrating. So what do we need to hear from you guys?
Well, whenever I get an opportunity to share, I like to tell people that the folks that are inheriting the world that we live in, they're going to inherit what they want. This world that we live in, our young people or younger people, the people who are getting ready to come out and make decisions, and the folks who've been sitting back looking and watching but have been maybe too young or just not given an opportunity to speak up, they recognize that one day their chance is coming. And right now we're loading them. We're loading our young people with the information, with the resources, and more than that, with the heart and love, support. I got your back. Me in my position, with my age or my influence and my connections, we got these young folks. Run. Don't just vote. Become the elected officials.
All right, yes.
That's going to do 90% of the work, to be the elected official in line or aligned with the values that best serve humanity, our communities, from a worldwide perspective to a local perspective. Become that person.
Yes.
What you feel like needs to happen and should happen, nothing is stopping you.
Be the change. That's what
be the change that we want to see. So that's something that we are working on, and so, or that we're always working on. Become those elected officials, and then of course, if when we run into problems there, galvanizing each other to vote. There's an organization here, Mississippi Votes, that's doing radical work around young people in voter education, voter registration, civic engagement. You know, here in the Deep South, civic engagement is Black folks' bag. It's our it's our way. It's had to be our way because of how we live here. So civic engagement is a big deal. But then also information and education in our communities, making sure that folks know what's going on, because headlines are triggering, right? When you see a headline, you're just going off of, oh my God, ring the alarm. But once you start educating folks about what's really going on, and you can create a sense of not only collaboration, but also a sense of peace around the fact that things have been going on as long as we've been alive, and things gonna keep going on as long as we alive. What we got to do is have a plan, which is what we're always doing. We're always at the drawing board, always strategizing, always coming up with the plan. And so also knowing, you know, an organizer's heart is one of the greatest assets that we have, because we're willing to take those risks. If somebody calls me and say the abortion, it's over, a Roe versus it's overturned and now it's criminal. If somebody calls me, I'm going to do what I need to do to support this person, regardless. That's our way. That's our nature, right?
I'm so excited, Amanda, to hear you say that young people in Mississippi are civically engaged.
Yes.
And that you are encouraging them, and organizations are encouraging them not just to vote, but to get involved even more by becoming those elected officials and being the change. That's so encouraging. A final question for you, Marsha. I got to run. Are you going to be at the next Women's March?
I'm going to be.
I know you won't have to pick out, but are you going to be there?
I'm going to be at the next Women's March. Had you asked me this after we last spoke, I probably would have told you no. I was categorically not going to participate in all of this anymore, because I was really over it. But I'm thankful for the time that I've had off. I come back with a renewedness, and I'm so grateful to have such amazing young folk working at the Afia Center. We was at a rally yesterday, and to see them take that mic and to move this forward, I feel good. I feel like we can win. And so, yes, I will be at the next march. Wherever it's at, I will be there. Even if it's in the audience, making sure that younger Black woman who work at the Afia Center is now holding that mic and moving this conversation forward. I will be at the march.
All right, that's what I wanted to hear, because all hands on deck. This is a fight of all rights. And like I said, it's not just about abortion rights. This is about all the rights that we enjoy in this country, and particularly those of us who have been locked out of this country, and the rights that others have enjoyed. We can't disappear. We can't shrink. We can't make ourselves invisible. We got to be, as loud, as bold, and as aggressive about this as we can possibly be, because we really are fighting for our lives. And I want to thank you women, because you are leading that from two very, very difficult places in the South. I get to be in California, where women can get an abortion, and we're going to do even more to welcome women from all over the country who may be in states where abortions may be illegal because of the overturning of Roe, or just maybe your own state laws. But again, thank you so much for the work you're doing. We're going to be watching. Got a lot of work to do, and we know that you two ladies will be at the fore of that work. So thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
All right. And I hope it's okay to say support the abortion funds. Support the abortion funds. And even though we're jamming in Mississippi, young folks across the South, especially the rural South, we out here. So be looking for us.
Support the funds. Absolutely. Love that plug. Again, we are going to stay with this. I want to thank all my guests this morning.
Yes.
This is not going anywhere. I don't know if you were under a rock for the last 2 days, but this is the biggest story in the news, and it will continue to dominate the news cycles, as it should, because the implications are so humongous. And whether you are glued to your television or your social media sites, following this day by day, moment by moment, make sure you are checking in, because like I said, so many rights are at stake, not just abortions, So don't tell me you don't care about abortions or abortions don't impact your life, because this case and this decision, this potential decision that could become final in 2 months, opens the door for Republicans who have been on a mission for decades now to roll back so many of the rights that we enjoy, and for these Republicans, mostly white men, to further implement their form of patriarchy. And you heard the professor say that their form of morality, Justice Alito and others on the Supreme Court and others in these state legislators and these Republican senators, they are determining what is moral and what's not. And we can't allow them to do that, because they aren't the final arbiters of what we as a country should be doing and can do. So we've got to stand up everywhere around this country and resist. We've got to reject those that would try to maintain the status quo. And we've got to do what Marsha did. We've got to get our second win. We've got to get rejuvenated, because we got a long battle ahead. Stay with us. And right here on the special report, we're going to make sure that you have everything you need, all the information, all the resources, so that you can fight this battle, because we are all in this together. Be safe out there, my friends.